Okay, so why are we talking about some silly anime game instead of an industry-defining title with cinematic storytelling or graphics that blur the line between reality and gaming? Well, it's simple really. Scarlet Nexus isn't just some dumb anime game. It was one of the best games that released in 2021, but it's not perfect and I don't think it's for everyone. Therefore, this review is for those who are on the fence about this game or see it on sale or Games Pass and wonder if it's worth trying. So, let's discuss why you don't want to skip Scarlet Nexus. When Scarlet Nexus was revealed in 2020, the major talking points around the game weren't necessarily about the game itself, but mainly that it would be the first anime game to be released on next-gen consoles. And honestly, it didn't look like there was much to say about the game. As gameplay footage trickled out over the following months, the game seemed like the standard fare button-mashy anime game that Bandai Namco are known to produce. It looked great on next-gen consoles, and it certainly had a sense of style with its stiletto-wearing enemies, but I, like many others at the time, doubted this game would be anything more than a shallow, if not forgettable, gameplay experience. Now, that might sound cynical, but if you're familiar with the anime game genre, with few exceptions, many are no more than licensed cash grabs with just enough effort put in to pull in casual fans of a franchise. And they are almost always published by Bandai Namco. So despite Scarlet Nexus being an entirely new IP, I believe Bandai saw the lack of buzz the game was getting and made the wise decision to release a demo. Not only did this show confidence in the game about a month ahead of its launch, but it allowed credible voices in the space to offer their perspectives. I personally watched Globku's coverage of the game, both the demo and its full release. It was the first time that I was given the impression that the game was much better than it looked, and once I played it for myself, I discovered this was true. It was a complete and bug-free experience on day one. When you buy Scarlet Nexus now, you're getting a complete game with two protagonists, each with their own storyline taking anywhere from 10 to 12 hours to complete. Add to that side quest and newly added in-game content, and you're looking at upwards of 40 to 50 hours of content right out of the box, depending on how much you want to devote to playing this game. And I think this speaks to the level of care that the developers put into this game, and nowhere is that more true than the game's presentation. Scarlet Nexus has a unique style and presentation that lended a strong visual identity and presence. The game's setting is in an alternate history take of our near future, in which, in place of smartphones, mankind has developed psionic abilities that, in addition to granting a minority of people superpowers, allow characters to talk to each other using only their thoughts and interact with their environments in ways only available to those with psionic abilities. This is visually communicated to the player through two main motifs, the brain and human connection. Almost every visual in this game is bringing one of those two things to the forefront of the player experience. This is done in some obvious ways, like the way the psionic cables jack into the player's mind when they enter their super mode. But in more subtle ways as well, such as the red strings that frames the game's scenes, and orange cables that thread through each of the characters' uniforms. The developers refer to this visual style as brainpunk, and I honestly think experiencing it is one of the best things the game has to offer. Now, when looking at the character designs, a lot of work went into making each character look distinct, and I learned from developer interviews that uniforms were tailored to fit a character's powers. Whether it be evoking a firefighter for a character with pyrokinesis, or making a suit out of rubber for a character with electric powers. I'd be lying if I said I noticed these little details on my playthroughs of the game, but it is nice to know that developers put these little touches in there for players with the eyes to see them. More noticeable are the standout enemy designs, which evoke a sense of body horror and perplexity as you try to work out the anatomy of what you're looking at. There's actually a fairly nice story detail to why these enemies, known as others, look the way they do, but I won't spoil that here. Instead, I'll just point out that the creativity expressed through their design, which mix inorganic and organic materials, is refreshing. I find that the elements I just detailed work together to lay the foundations of a world that will remain visually distinct in a crowded anime genre. And I hope this world will be explored better in a future sequel. Which is why it is so disappointing that the game's plot and characters fail to live up to the world in which they inhabit. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this because I think it is the most subjective part of your experience with Scarlet Nexus, but I did not enjoy the story or characters all that much. As mentioned, the game takes place in an alternate reality future, In this future, a celestial anomaly known as the Extinction Belt has ringed the entire globe, producing brain-eating monsters known as the Others. Fortunately, mankind is able to fight back with a group of powerful psionics who are able to manifest a variety of powers and suppress the Others. They form an elite group known as the Other Suppression Force, or OSF for short. You play as either Yuito Sumeragi or Kasane Randall, both new recruits to the OSF who both wield the power of psychokinesis. Throughout their campaigns, you will attempt to uncover the truth behind the Others, the nature of psionics, and the state of humanity. Now, this setup had the potential to be great, but failed due to poor pacing and staid characters. There are a number of twists and turns to the plot, any of which fundamentally alter our characters' understanding of the world, but the game does not devote enough time to any of them to allow them to fully develop. It feels like you'll uncover one mind-altering conspiracy just to learn another a few hours later. It gives the plot a feeling of being convoluted, even if individually each plot thread is fairly easy to track. This type of storytelling is typical to your seasonal anime, so tolerance for this kind of plot pacing will come down to individual taste. For myself, it was too much spread too thin. There is also an anime adaptation of this game available for you to watch, but from everything I've heard, it is better left unwatched. But my biggest problem is the main characters. I've got almost 40 hours into this game, and honestly, I cannot remember almost anything interesting about any one of the cast. This is despite spending hours giving them gifts and trying to get them to like me. This stands in stark contrast to the characters in Persona or Final Fantasy, where even if you don't like a character, they are indeed memorable. None of Scarlet Nexus' characters stand out, and when you spend time with them to understand more of their backstories, I found myself being bored to tears by how generic they were. Yet the biggest offenders are the playable characters themselves, who just don't seem to act in ways a normal human being should in the situations they find themselves in. Yuito is simply unreasonably nice and bland. Characters try multiple times to kill him or commit heinous crimes against his family, and he is just unreasonably understanding of it all. I swear you could kill this man's dog right in front of him, and he would spend the next 5 hours trying to talk to you about why you did it. However, just because I did not like him doesn't mean you won't either. So I think a good litmus test is if you've ever played the Trails of Cold Steel series and you like the protagonist Rin, then you'll probably get along with Yuito just fine. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you've got Kasane, who comes across as if she's never had a normal conversation with another human being before. There are elements to her backstory that could be used to justify her behavior, but none of which I find convincing, leaving you with two protagonists, one unlikable and the other as bland as white bread. All character interactions are infected by just bafflingly unnatural interactions. Due to story developments I won't spoil here, the main cast of characters come into serious conflict with one another, to the point where there is serious consideration that they may kill or seriously harm one another. Yet, these characters will try to kill each other one day and literally go get coffee with each other the next. It just doesn't seem like anything a normal person will do. Scarlet Nexus is split into 12 phases for each character. Each phase is split into two parts. One where you fight enemies in linear levels and combat arenas, and another that is called the standby phase, where the player can explore various hubs, do side quests, spend time with your teammates, and give gifts. As mentioned, levels are pretty linear affairs, not offering much outside of hallways broken by arenas to fight enemies. There are side alleys that contain extra encounters and materials that you can use for upgrades, but for the most part you'll be going from hallway to room, and occasionally a pretty large room for a boss fight. And these are usually denoted by a save point where you can heal your party and buy items. Now many might point out the linearity as a flaw in the game's design, but I don't really think that's fair. This is an action RPG, and I'm not looking for mini-games or a bunch of collectibles to waste my time on. Give me a variety of enemies to fight in visually varied locations, and I'll be happy. Scarlet Nexus does this and more, with each level you visit presenting a new visual style and unique contextual actions based on what's in the environment. This prevents levels from feeling like simple window dressing for the fights, and layers in a small level of strategy depending on where you fight enemies. Where level design does fail in my opinion is the amount of content on offer relative to the game's length. Were this a pure action game at about 8 to 10 hours, then the variety in enemies and levels wouldn't have the chance to feel stale. But since this is the length of a typical RPG, there are simply not enough unique levels for the game's runtime, especially if you play through it twice. Even on one playthrough, prepare to see the same levels multiple times. Another thing I should mention is that due to the abundance of save points and healing items, rarely does the game feel frustrating, apart from one boss that really could have used a checkpoint. But if you would like a more fulfilling combat experience, then I would recommend you play the game on hard, otherwise it might feel too easy. The standby phase are a decompression period between missions, and as mentioned, the main features include taking on side quests and gift giving. I think the less said about side quests, the better. In my entire experience with the game, only a handful were not fetch quests, and the only nice thing I would say about them is that I'm glad that you can turn them in from the menu screen. They do reward rare materials from time to time, but for the most part, I avoided side quests like the plague. The real meat here are the gifts. Collecting enough materials on missions, you'll be able to exchange them for items to give to your teammates. This, along with the bond missions that give you more insight into these characters' backstories, will raise your bond rank with them, giving you more access to moves and abilities during combat. What's cool about this is that you're not limited in choosing who to give gifts to or spend time with in any given phase. Give as many gifts to as many people as you can in any given phase. The only downside to this, as mentioned earlier, is that the stories that your party members tell are not particularly interesting. What is extremely cool, however, is that you actually see your teammates using the gifts that you give them, and by the end of the game, your hideout will be completely decorated with the items you've both given and received. It is a very nice touch, and I hope more games follow suit in the future. Ultimately, Scarlet Nexus' level design and structure do a great job keeping you engaged, even if there is not enough content for the runtime. But what matters most is that the levels and gift giving all feed into making the best aspect of the game even better.
There's nowhere to run.
Scarlet Nexus absolutely nails its combat. What I thought would be a shallow system is actually rather complex. A confluence of design decisions that meld together to create the most satisfying action RPG experience of 2021. At its foundation, you have your basic attacks with damage enemy health, and your psychokinesis attacks with both do damage and fill the enemy crush gauge, which once filled, allows you to perform an instant finisher. However, using your psychokinesis attacks drains Yuito and Kasane's psychokinesis gauge, and must be refilled through special attacks. On a basic level, combat is about balancing these three different attacks to maintain a flow and kill your enemies as quickly and stylishly as possible. But this is just the beginning. Using your brain map, you can upgrade your character to learn new moves and prioritize different styles of play. And outside of these basics are four main mechanics that need to be discussed. The first is the SAS system, which allows you to borrow the power of any one of your party members. This is particularly useful for exploiting enemy weaknesses, such as borrowing lightning to attack a water-based other or fire to attack an oil-based other. As you spend time developing bonds with the characters in your team, your SAS skills improve, opening up new moves, call-out attacks, and depending on how you spec your character, even being able to use multiple powers at once.
Get going! We should use the Nazi's power. Leave it to me!
Nice fire! You got this!
Keep it up!
I hands down believe the SAS system is the best part of the combat system, and I hope is further developed in a sequel. Next up is the brain drive. Once the brain drive gauge fills up, Yuito and Kasane get a buff to their attack, speed, and psychokinesis. Spec into brain drive and you will be able to increase its length and get XP bonuses. The biggest issue, and this has thankfully been fixed with a free DLC mod, is that you cannot activate brain drive at will, so it can pop in a fight where it is unneeded, but be absent in a fight where you do. It's a weird design decision that I hope gets changed in the sequel, but I believe this decision was made to highlight the next ability. Brainfield brings enemies into your space where your powers operate at their maximum, similar in concept to the domain expansion in Jujutsu Kaisen. However, while this sounds cool, there are some major drawbacks if you don't upgrade this skill. For one, you cannot use SAS, and your moveset changes to being quick and fast to something pretty slow and altogether clunky. On top of that, you still take damage, and your character will stop and hold their head in pain whenever the gauge is running low. These drawbacks make me prioritize Brain Drive over Brain Field in both of my playthroughs. However, once I finally had enough leftover skill points to upgrade it, I discovered that Brain Field is actually the more powerful of the two options, because once you unlock things like invulnerability and more moves, it is clear that this is meant to be a room clearing mechanic. Finally, there is the perfect dodge system, which I believe is the one true blemish on a really great combat system. You see, a perfect dodge or dodge offset is a risk-reward system where a player who spends the time learning an enemy's moveset is rewarded for waiting until the last moment to dodge with a special attack or buff. In Bayonetta, you get a time slowdown, in Nier Automata, you get a special animation, and even in Devil May Cry, if you perfect time a Royal Guard, you can do crazy damage. However, if the reward isn't good enough, the player is not incentivized to try a perfect dodge and will just run around the map willy-nilly. And this is where Scarlet Nexus's dodge fails. When you commit a perfect dodge, you get a special animation, but enemy reactions are inconsistent at best and unperturbed at worst. It is common to have enemies continue their attack animations despite performing a perfect dodge, which in turn actually punishes you for learning the timing. This is especially true for bosses and is only mitigated by using the Clairvoyance SAS skill, which makes the dodge both easier to pull off and more damaging. What's worse is that you cannot cancel into your dodge animations, which I do not feel matches the pace of combat. I hope this receives the biggest change in a potential sequel. Simply allow characters to cancel their attacks into dodge, and make sure that anytime you hit a perfect dodge, there is a meaningful reaction from enemies. Even with that minor complaint aside, this is probably the most fun I've had with an anime action game or an action RPG in a very long time, and it easily carries you through the 40 or so hours it takes to complete 2 playthroughs. There are other elements such as side quests and cosmetics, which are nice additions, but really, if you're going to buy this game, you're going to buy it for the combat. And I wholeheartedly recommend checking it out specifically for that purpose. Right now is probably the best time to jump into Scarlet Nexus. For one, you can get it for free on Games Pass, or at least find it heavily discounted on Amazon. In addition, new in-game content has been added in the form of an arena where you can test your skills against high-level enemies for more cosmetic rewards and new weapons. If anything in this review has sounded appealing to you, then please do not hesitate to buy this game. It is not perfect, as I point out, but even if you have a passing interest in action games, Scarlet Nexus is well worth your time. The presentation is excellent, the combat is good fun, and you are guaranteed to have a complete experience right out of the box. I highly recommend this game and think Scarlet Nexus is one game you do not want to miss out on.